In recent days, the world has witnessed a wave of breaking news about rising global trade tensions. But while attention focused on Asia and Europe, a different shock came from a place Washington did not expect: Burkina Faso. On the edge of Ouagadougou, inside a modest industrial zone, rows of cotton bales stand stacked like quiet fortresses. Under the harsh white lights of the factory, they look less like cargo and more like a signal. These bales are not waiting for export. They are waiting for an order, and that order has now arrived. Burkina Faso has activated the Cotton-for-Tariff Act, a decision unlike anything seen before in West Africa's trade history. The move came only hours after the European Union and the United States announced new tariffs, ranging from 30% to 45% on Burkina Faso's refined cotton. In Washington, the timing could not have been worse. The United States is already facing declining cotton yields in several southern states. Water costs are rising. Weather patterns are hurting seasonal output. Domestic supply chains are under pressure, and many manufacturers have quietly depended on low-cost African cotton to stabilize production. So when Burkina Faso struck back with a countermeasure valued at $5.1 billion, the impact was immediate. Western apparel giants, Zara, H&M, Gap, Levi's, suddenly found themselves exposed. Their profit models rely heavily on affordable cotton from the Sahel. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. But on the streets of Burkina Faso, the mood is different. Here, cotton is not simply a commodity, it is the life work of millions of farmers. It is a symbol of labor that has long been undervalued on the world stage. Many young Africans see this moment not only as retaliation, but as a declaration that their work, their land, and their future deserve a fair place in the global market. And across Africa, a quiet question begins to rise. If one nation can send a $5 billion shock through the global supply chain, what happens when an entire region stands together? Subscribe Faso Future TV so you never miss the latest updates and in-depth analysis on Burkina Faso and Africa. This is only the beginning. What happens next will define the future of this conflict. The trade dispute began as a technical adjustment on paper, but the impact reached far deeper. When the European Union and the United States imposed new tariffs on Burkina Faso's refined cotton, officials framed the decision as a routine policy update meant to protect domestic industries. Yet inside West Africa, it was understood as something larger. For many, it felt like a reminder that global markets still prefer Africa as a supplier of raw goods, not as a producer with its own value chain. Burkina Faso had spent years upgrading its cotton sector. New ginning facilities, modern spinning lines, and regional training programs allowed the country to shift from exporting raw fiber to exporting refined cotton with higher market value. For the first time, local producers began to see the rewards of their work. When the tariffs arrived, that progress was suddenly at risk. The fear was simple. If these new trade barriers stayed in place, decades of effort could be erased overnight. Inside the Ministry of Trade in Ouagadougou, advisors examined every scenario. Some urged caution. Others argued that backing down would send a dangerous message to the world. In the end, the decision was made. Burkina Faso would answer. And it would not answer halfway. The Cotton-for-Tariff Act was drafted, signed, and announced within 48 hours. It targeted Western apparel giants that relied heavily on Sahel cotton to keep prices stable. The moment the act was activated, supply contracts worth billions froze in place. Emails were sent from Ouagadougou to the headquarters of Zara, H&M, Gap, and Levi's. The message was short and formal. New terms, new conditions, and immediate renegotiation. Across Europe and the United States, procurement teams scrambled. Many had no backup plan. The industry had grown comfortable with the belief that African suppliers would always remain quiet, predictable, and inexpensive. Meanwhile, in the agricultural regions of Burkina Faso, the news spread quickly. In Koudougou, a farmer named Issa watched the announcement on a small television at a local cafe. His reaction was steady, not explosive. He had lived through market collapses, droughts, and price manipulation from buyers who controlled the export chain. This time felt different. This time, the government was not asking farmers to endure the consequences. It was taking the hit alongside them. For Issa, it felt like someone had finally stepped onto the field to defend the work of ordinary people. Inside the United States, the response took a different turn. Analysts warned that the timing of the African countermeasure was unusually sharp. Cotton production across several southern states had fallen due to weather instability, lack of irrigation, and rising fertilizer costs. Storage levels were lower than projected. Retailers were already concerned about inflation and supply delays. Losing access to low-cost African cotton threatened to widen cracks in the domestic market. For American companies operating on thin margins, even a small disruption could ripple across entire product lines. Washington issued a cautionary statement. It described Burkina Faso's move as economic escalation and expressed concern that African tariff retaliation could undermine cooperation. But the language did not carry the same confidence as before. Behind the official posture, many understood that the United States had limited leverage. Replacing millions of tons of Sahel cotton was not as simple as shifting suppliers on a spreadsheet. It meant new shipping routes, higher labor costs, and months of delays. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, found itself gaining unexpected support. In Mali and Niger, radio shows invited experts to discuss the move. Callers expressed pride, frustration, hope, and a sense that something long overdue had finally begun. A textile worker in Bamako told a reporter that Africa had spent decades exporting its cotton cheaply, only to buy back expensive clothing. She said the new tariffs were a reminder that dignity had a price, and that price could no longer be ignored. At the center of it all stood one man, Ibrahim Traore. His government framed the move not as aggression, but as a demand for fairness. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was willing to trade. It was willing to negotiate, but it would no longer accept a system where its people worked hard while others set the value of their labor. The trade war had begun, and the world was suddenly paying attention. The next phase would come quickly, and it would test not only markets, but resolve. The turning point came faster than anyone expected. For several days, Western companies believed the dispute would settle quietly. They assumed Burkina Faso would soften under pressure, or that internal divisions inside the government would slow the response. But when the counter-tariffs triggered their full effect across Europe and the United States, the reaction was immediate and loud. Inside Zara's logistics center in Spain, managers received the first impact report. Cotton prices had risen more than 20% in less than 48 hours. By the end of the week, financial analysts warned of disrupted inventories and delayed shipments. At H&M, procurement officers faced a similar crisis. Contracts that had been renewed every year without negotiation were suddenly no longer valid. A single change in West Africa was now shaking boardrooms across the Western world. But the greatest surprise came from Washington. The United States Trade Representative held an emergency briefing. The tone was firm, yet the underlying concern was unmistakable. The statement warned that African tariff retaliation could destabilize critical supply lines and damage long-term relationships. What the statement did not say was even more revealing. America had entered this dispute at a moment of weakness. Cotton yields in several states were falling. Water shortages were growing. Domestic supply chains were stretched. The West, for the first time in years, found itself negotiating from an exposed position. While Western officials debated their next move, a very different reaction emerged across the African continent. In Bamako, local radio stations opened their morning programs with a new question: is this the beginning of Africa's economic awakening? Callers from small villages and large cities shared the same sentiment. They were proud, they were surprised, and they were ready for more. The emotional center of the story shifted from anger to resolve. A young weaver in Niamey spoke with a calm certainty. She said she had spent years watching foreign buyers set the price of the cotton her family grew. She said it never felt like a partnership. It felt like survival. When she heard about Burkina Faso's response, she felt something she had never felt in her work: control. For the first time, she believed the value of African labor might be recognized on African terms. In Burkina Faso, Traore addressed the nation with a steady voice. He did not raise his tone. He did not speak of victory or confrontation. Instead, he spoke about fairness, dignity, and the right of Africans to benefit from their own production. He described the tariffs imposed by the West as a message written without respect, and he said the Cotton-for-Tariff Act was Burkina Faso's reply, written with clarity and purpose. His words spread across the region. In Mali, commentators praised the calm strength of his message. In Niger, newspapers printed headlines suggesting that a new kind of leadership was emerging, one that did not bow under pressure, but answered it with strategy. The reaction was not only political, it was personal. People felt seen. People felt represented. Then came the most dramatic moment of all. Reports confirmed that Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were preparing to activate a shared cotton framework under the AES alliance. This would mean unified pricing, shared refining capacity, coordinated export rules, and a collective stance against external pressure. For Western corporations, this was the worst-case scenario. A fragmented Africa could be pressured. A united Africa could not. As news of the alliance leaked, markets reacted instantly. European stocks for textile companies dipped. American analysts raised concerns about long-term inflation in the apparel sector. But inside West Africa, the reaction could not have been more different. In Ouagadougou's central market, a man selling fabric told a journalist that history had turned a corner. He said Africa had always carried the weight of the global supply chain, but now, for once, it was placing its hand on the scale. The climax of the conflict was clear. The West had initiated a tariff strike. Burkina Faso had answered with force, and now an entire region was preparing to stand behind that answer. What began as a dispute over cotton had transformed into a test of sovereignty and unity. The world watched closely. But the real question was not what the West would do next. The real question was how far Africa was willing to go. The consequences of the tariff war did not remain inside ministries or corporate boardrooms. They moved quickly into daily life, shaping conversations in markets, radio stations, village squares, and political halls across West Africa and beyond. What began as a technical dispute had become a social and political moment that touched millions. In Burkina Faso, the first visible change was confidence. Farmers who had lived for decades at the mercy of global prices began to speak with a sense of purpose. In the cotton-growing region of Houndé, community leaders gathered beneath the shade of an acacia tree, discussing the future. Older men who remembered the lowest price years said they had never seen this kind of national unity around a trade decision. Younger farmers spoke of investing in better tools and irrigation systems if the new tariffs helped raise long-term revenue. For the first time, small producers felt the government was not only listening, but fighting on their behalf. Local cooperatives responded just as quickly. In Koudougou and Bobo Dioulasso, textile groups held emergency meetings to explore new markets within Africa. Some proposed direct sales to regional manufacturers. Others suggested building local brands instead of sending raw material overseas. The sense of possibility was tangible. Cotton was no longer a one-way export. It was becoming a foundation for industry, for identity, and for pride. But the consequences extended beyond economics. Politically, Burkina Faso gained unexpected momentum. Surveys conducted by regional media outlets showed a surge in public approval for policies that asserted national control over resources. Traore's decision was not viewed as confrontation for its own sake. It was seen as protection of workers, protection of value, and protection of dignity. Even critics who had questioned the government's economic reforms admitted that the tariff response had united the population in a rare moment of shared purpose. The ripple effects reached across borders. In Mali, political analysts noted that Burkina Faso's firm stance had influenced local debates about agricultural policy and trade independence. Niger experienced a similar shift, with economic groups encouraging the government to adopt more assertive strategies toward international buyers. In Senegal, radio commentators discussed whether West Africa was entering a new era where nations negotiated as equals rather than as suppliers under pressure. Yet not all consequences were positive or easy. Some families worried about short-term disruptions in income if Western buyers paused orders. Small merchants feared that temporary uncertainty could affect local markets. Others questioned whether Burkina Faso could maintain its position if the conflict escalated. These concerns were real, and they echoed through communities already familiar with the fragile nature of global trade. Despite these concerns, a deeper transformation was taking place, a psychological one. A sense of agency was spreading. For many Africans, the ability of a small nation to confront major powers without folding was a statement that reached far beyond cotton fields. It suggested that Africa was not a silent participant in the global economy. It could respond. It could negotiate. It could defend its interests. Inside the United States, the social impact moved along different lines. Major apparel companies issued warnings to shareholders. Some predicted price increases. Others signaled possible layoffs or reduced store inventories. For many American consumers, cotton shortages were an unexpected reminder of how deeply their everyday goods were tied to distant supply chains. Commentators on financial networks asked if the United States had underestimated Africa's importance at a time when domestic agriculture was already under strain. Politically, lawmakers in Washington faced pressure from two sides. Some demanded a tougher stance to force Africa back into previous trade patterns. Others argued that the tariff war was a sign of deteriorating influence and that the United States should approach Africa with respect instead of pressure. For the first time in years, Africa had become part of the American political conversation, not as a recipient of aid, but as a player with leverage. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, life continued with a sense of anticipation. In markets, people spoke of unity with neighboring countries. In schools, teachers explained the meaning of tariffs and sovereignty. In cotton fields, workers looked at their crops with new eyes, seeing not just a plant, but a future shaped by their own decisions. The consequences of the tariff war were no longer theoretical. They were personal. They were national. And they were reshaping the political landscape of the region. But as the dust settled and the first reactions took shape, one question pressed forward. If Africa stood united, how would the United States and the rest of the world respond next? Around the world, governments and analysts watched the Burkina Faso tariff strike with a level of attention rarely given to a West African trade decision. For Washington, the event arrived during a period of internal strain. American agriculture was already navigating rising production costs, water shortages, and unpredictable climate conditions. When the Cotton-for-Tariff Act reshaped the supply chain, the United States found itself confronting a challenge it had not anticipated. A small African nation holding leverage over a sector that feeds directly into American retail, manufacturing, and seasonal consumer spending. Inside the White House, policy advisors debated the best response. Some argued that the United States should pressure the region to reverse the tariffs, warning that Africa's stance could inspire similar moves from other nations. Others urged caution. They pointed out that alienating West Africa could push the region closer to new trade partners, especially China, and emerging blocs seeking to expand influence across the Sahel. What unsettled Washington most was not the immediate financial loss, but the precedent. Nations that once accepted unfavorable trade dynamics were now willing to push back. Global markets reacted with equal concern. European textile companies warned of cost increases that could last months or even years. East Asian manufacturers studied the situation closely, sensing opportunities to fill supply gaps, but also recognizing the risk of becoming targets of future commodity realignments. Financial networks describe the conflict as a sign that Africa was entering a new phase, one where it negotiated not from weakness, but from necessity and confidence. In Paris, the conversation took a more historical tone. Commentators noted that the Sahel had long served as a low-cost resource zone for the Western economy. The idea that Burkina Faso could disrupt billion-dollar industries with a single legislative act challenged assumptions that had stood untested for decades. French analysts warned that if the AES alliance consolidated around cotton, it could influence other sectors: gold, livestock, energy corridors, reshaping the entire economic map of the region. At the United Nations, diplomats framed the dispute as a reminder that global supply chains were changing faster than political institutions could adapt. Several African representatives used the moment to highlight the need for fairer trade terms and industrial development within the continent. Their message was simple: stability cannot exist without equity. Across Africa, the global reaction reinforced a powerful idea. The world was paying attention. The world was recalculating. And for the first time in a long time, the world was adjusting around Africa, not the other way around. As the international debate grew louder, one question remained unresolved. How far was Burkina Faso willing to take this? And how would the global balance shift if the AES alliance expanded its ambitions beyond cotton? The tariff conflict began as a dispute over cotton, but it has grown into something far larger. It has become a test of will, a test of identity, and a test of how much economic power Africa is prepared to claim. Burkina Faso did not seek a confrontation. It sought respect. Yet the reaction from Western institutions showed how deeply the old patterns still run. When Africa raises its voice, the world listens, but not always with understanding. Often, it listens with fear. Across West Africa, people now speak of this moment as a turning point. Markets are changing. Alliances are forming. For decades, global supply chains treated the continent as a reservoir of raw materials, a place to extract from, not a partner to negotiate with. But the Cotton-for-Tariff Act sent a different message. It said that Africa is willing to protect its work, its land, and its value. The coming months will reveal how strong that message really is. If the AES Cotton Alliance holds, if Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger truly coordinate their production, pricing, and export rules, the effect will reach far beyond cotton fields. It could reshape global relationships, redirect investment, and redefine how the world views African sovereignty. But if the alliance fractures under external pressure, the momentum could fade as quickly as it rose. There is a deeper question behind the politics. It is the question of whether Africa believes enough in its own future to stand firm when the pressure grows. A farmer in Houndé said it simply: "Cotton is our work, but dignity is our right." His words capture the heart of the conflict. It is not only about dollars. It is about standing tall in a system designed to keep others small. For the United States, the warning is clear. A world in transition requires new relationships, not old assumptions. Africa is not the margin of the global economy anymore. It is becoming one of its centers, and nations that fail to adapt may find themselves negotiating from a position of weakness they never expected. As we close this chapter, the path ahead remains uncertain. The stakes are real. The choices are historic. And the consequences will shape the future of both continents. If you believe these stories matter, and if you want clear and steady coverage of Africa's rise, subscribe and watch more video on our channel.